Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar. Whether you are joining us live this afternoon or watching a recording of this later on YouTube, we are so glad that you are here today in this webinar jointly sponsored by Menno Media and Mennonite Church Eastern Canada. My name is Amy Gingrich, and I serve as Executive Director and Publisher at Menno Media. Today's webinar is focused on Leader Magazine, published by Menno Media, and specifically the worship resources found in this summer's issue of Leader Magazine, worship resources focused on wild church and its various expressions. Wendy Jansen is with us today, pastor of Burning Bush Forest Church and eco-minister at Mennonite Church Eastern Canada. Before I turn it over to Wendy and the panelists that she's gathered, I just want to mention two other items. First of all, in the chat, you're going to find a link to the worship resources in Leader Magazine. So whether you're a subscriber or not, obviously we encourage you to subscribe and would welcome you to subscribe to Leader Magazine. But we're putting here in the chat the link and the password to access those worship resources from this summer's issue. In addition, we're going to take time toward the end to answer some questions. Please use the Q&A function here in the webinar today to ask your questions. We will post links to you in the chat of things we want you to access, but you should go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A. And I'll turn it now over to Wendy.
Thank you, Amy. It's really great to be here. And I have three other Mennonite Wild Church leaders with me as well to help. And so we're going to introduce ourselves a little bit. And I'll just say we've also created some slides that represent some of the wild churches who participated and submitted things for this summer worship series. So you'll get a chance to see some images that are worth 1,000 words that tell you a little bit about how some of the different contributors what their worship looks like. And as we're introducing ourselves, I could say that if you would like, you can also put in the chat who you are and where you are. If you want to say anything about your watershed or a land acknowledgement, that's a little bit about what we will be sharing as well as we introduce ourselves. So as Amy said, I'm Wendy Jansen. I'm pastor at Burning Bush Forest Church. And here you can see on the slide, there's a picture, a painting, an artist rendition of my watershed, which is the Grand River watershed. And superimposed on top of it is something called the Haldeman Tract. And it's that darker blue section that runs through the middle of my watershed. And it is land on 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from its source to its mouth that was promised to the people of the Six Nations in perpetuity. For them and their descendants. And so we worship and we live on this tract of land, of which there's only 4% of the original tract that is currently available to the people of the Six Nations who were supposed to have it in perpetuity. And so we remember that when we gather to worship, that this is part of our history and it's part of our story. We meet in a city park in the city of Waterloo, where Laurel Creek flows through, and Laurel Creek is a tributary of the Grand River. And I have to say that I absolutely love leading Forest Church. We've been doing this since 2014, so we've celebrated our 8th anniversary together, worshiping outdoors all year round. And I helped co-found the Wild Church Network around the same time. And part of what is important to me, or I find valuable about leading Wild Church, is that I've sensed God's presence in nature ever since I was a child. And I also have discovered and learned about myself that I have a rather kinesthetic spirituality, that I pray best when I move. And so both of those things I can access when I'm leading Forest Church. And I'll pass it on to Sandy.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm Sandy Drescher-Lehman, and I pastor at Methacton Mennonite Church, but the Wild Church is another passion of mine that has grown up in the last couple of years. My husband, John, and I lead a Wild Church each month on the 3rd Sunday of the month in the afternoon at our home, which is also a retreat center. And we always say at the beginning that we are on the unceded ancestral land of the Lenape people here in Southeast Pennsylvania, where their spirits continue to live. And then we also say that the creek that runs through our property is the Ridge Valley Creek that flows into the Unami, into the Perkiomen, into the Schuylkill, into the Delaware River, and it's all part of the Delaware watershed that goes into the Atlantic Ocean. And we moved here 24 years ago and wanted to provide and co-create a space for people like us that were busy and needed a break in their busy lives to spend time with God, to just be quiet. And so when we heard about Wild Church, it felt like a no-brainer. That is what we're doing here. That's what we want to offer to people. So if we can be part of a network that advertises that for us on their map, and we can tell people that it's open to the public at these regular times, it has become part of our dream that we've always lived into. So we too are very excited to be able to offer a Wild Church and be part of this network. And I'll pass it to Lee. Darren.
Thanks, Sandy. I'm Lee, along with Darren. I serve as a co-pastor of Estuary Church. And we're called Estuary Church because the land we live on is a delta. It's actually the name of the settler city where we live, Delta, British Columbia. This land is formed by the Fraser River, which begins in the Rockies and flows into the Salish Sea. And as it nears the Salish Sea here in British Columbia, the river slows down and deposits silt, creating the very land that we live on, which is also surrounded by an incredible estuary. This land is the traditional territory of the Hunkaminam speaking peoples, including the Swasin and Musqueam First Nations, and the Holkaminam speaking Huitsin First Nation, people who have lived in relationship with this beautiful place where the river runs into the sea since time immemorial. And you can see on the right, that's a picture of Boundary Bay, which spans the border between British Columbia and Washington State. This practice of Wild Church is something that I'm drawn to because it helps us contextualize our faith in a particular place, which is very important to me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Darren. I serve with Lee with Estuary Church in the Boundary Bay watershed. And I love Wild Church because I get to learn about our beautiful watershed and all the creatures and its inhabitants here. And now we have a quick poll that we're going to share with everyone to learn a little bit about the areas that we inhabit.
Alyssa, can you go ahead and share that? Thank you.
Okay, it's helpful to see what sort of contexts you're in terms of urban, town, or rural. So thank you. We would like to begin or move further into our webinar with a bit of time for prayer. And I invite you to pause, or invite us to pause to ground ourselves in our geographical place and in the sacred presence of God, wherever we are joining from. So if you are able to, or if you wish to, please close your eyes and notice your breath. Remember the reciprocity that happens with our breathing, how we receive oxygen from trees and plants, and how we return carbon dioxide from our lungs. Think about where you are right now. Think of where the building you are in is located. Think about the season that you're in, or that we are in, and the weather that you are experiencing today. Think of the plants that are sprouting or leafing or blooming. And think about the creatures who also live in your community. Birds and insects, mammals and amphibians. And remember that wherever you are part of God's community of creation, interconnected to the living web of life. And pause to expand your sense of awareness to God's presence with you in your silence and in the activity of life that is going on around you. And I'll offer us a prayer now, adapted just slightly from the call to worship submitted by Lee and Darren on page 40 of the Leader. God, who speaks in burning bushes, in the birds of the bay, in the stars of the heavens, in the flowers of springtime, we offer you our attention today. We pray that you might help us to notice you in new ways. We pray that we might be open to the various ways that you speak to us. May this be a rich time of learning infused with your Spirit. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Wendy. I have a short song that I'll be showing to us, or sharing with us, and the song is composed by Aaron McGawkin and arranged by Shonda Rule. This song checks many boxes for me. It's really simple, easy to pick up, also a little interesting. It's paperless, so you don't need sheet music. So we use this at our Wild Church quite often. It works great with just vocals. And the lyrics help bring us into the present, which I think is just a real goal of this spiritual life, tuning into the here and now. This song also makes connections, hopefully, between our bodies, the elements of the earth, and with God. A little reminder just to keep yourself muted, panelists, you as well. But please sing or hum wherever you are. I'll just put my hands towards myself here when I sing, and I'll put my hands out like this when you are to repeat where you are. It goes like this. I am here in the heart of God. I am here in the heart of God. And God is here in the heart of me. God is here in the heart of me. Like the wave in the water, in the water, in the wave. Like the wave in the water, in the water, in the wave. I am here in the heart of God. I am here in the heart of God. And I am here in the breath of God. I am here in the breath of God. And God is here in the heart breath of me. God is here in the breath of me. Like the wind in the springtime, in the springtime, in the wind. Like the wind in the springtime, in the springtime, in the wind. I am here in the breath of God. I am here in the breath of God. And I am here in the soul of God. I am here in the soul of God. And God is here in the soul of me. God is here in the soul of me. Like the flame in the fire, in the fire, in the flame. Like the flame in the fire, in the fire, in the flame. I am here in the soul of God. I am here in the soul of God. Like the flame in the fire, in the fire, in the flame. Like the flame in the fire, in the fire, in the flame. Like the wind in the springtime, in the springtime, in the wind. Like the wind in the springtime, in the springtime, in the wind. like the wave in the water, in the water, in the wave. The wave in the water, in the water, in the wave. I am here in the heart of God. I am here in the heart of God. So, thanks for joining on.
Thank you, Darren. That was beautiful. So we want to jump into just a little bit of explanation that what we're doing when we're doing Wild Church is not just transferring our regular kind of indoor worship into a park outdoors somewhere. There are some substantive differences between a Wild Church worship or a Forest Church worship and what we do indoors. And that doesn't diminish what we do indoors. That's a very valuable and important way that churches worship. But when we go outside for worship together as in a Wild Church kind of way, there are some fundamental differences in how we relate with and connect to and pay attention to and listen to God's presence in the world around us. And it's more informal, it's more relaxed, it's an embodied kind of experience, and it's very intentional in how we pay attention to God and creation. Sandy's going to say a bit more about that, but I just wanted to add that while we had 6 Wild Churches, part of Mennonite Church, who contributed to the summer worship series, there's over 30 people who participate in our Mennonite Wild Church Ministerial. So this is something that is finding roots, that is finding expression all over Canada and North America among Mennonites, let alone the hundreds who are doing it in different faith settings across Turtle Island and in other parts of the world. So, Sandy, go ahead and tell us a little bit more about how Wild Church is different from regular church.
Okay, thanks, Wendy. One of the things that was harder for me as a preacher pastor, and what I learned growing up and what I learned in seminary like 40 some years ago, was that we have 3 points to a sermon and we say them in 20 to 30 to 40 minutes. And if you don't have 3 points, at least hit the same point 3 to 5 different ways, right? Well, in Wild Church, we aren't the preacher. God is the preacher. God tells us the sermon, and our job is to listen. So our job as leaders of Wild Church are to send people out with a scripture. Maybe I often read from the First Nations version of a scripture and a theme, and then tell them to wander for half of the service out into the woods, onto the creek, around the property, anywhere they want to go to find and listen to God speaking. And after we'll talk more about the dynamics of them coming back, but that was a major difference for me as a preacher, and I'm guessing a lot of preacher worship leaders are on this Zoom. So fortunately, I have a husband that often tells me, you don't have to use so many words, although he often writes a poem to go with the theme, to just give people another avenue of inspiration as they go out from there. But whatever helps them connect to the creation that is around us at that time is what we look for and what we give just an introduction for as they go out. And I don't know, Wendy, do you want to say something about that picture that you make, the little books for the children and maybe adults too, so they can have more of a direction of what they see, what they smell, what they hear, what they taste even?
Yeah, I don't need to say any more about that right now.
Okay. Yeah. And we have another poll for you. It's an easy yes or no poll. Have you ever participated in Wild Church before? We were just interested in knowing how many people on this webinar have been part of a Wild Church anywhere. Cool.
Great. Thanks for sharing, everyone.
Oh,
All right. Sandy, do you have anything else to share there, or should we move on to the next section?
no, I would just say that that picture on the left there is a bowl of wild rice that I made for one church, and we made samples of the things that you can eat around our property, and everybody went foraging. So that was just one of the ways to connect with what we're walking on or what we're walking past all the time. That becomes part of our worship. So yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, and as Sandy opened up for us, there are just a myriad ways that you can experience wild church depending on where you are. The possibilities really are endless. Lee and I will just touch on briefly a few aspects of wild church liturgy as far as we've experienced that may be unique to wild church, different than an indoor worship experience. So Lee and I will touch on grounding, wandering, sharing or storytelling, and communion. So first, grounding. In worship gatherings within doors, you'll be familiar with welcomes, openings, perhaps preludes. All are ways to introduce us to whatever we're about to experience together and transition us from wherever we're coming from. A grounding does this and more. Simply, a grounding helps us settle. Wild church, as Sandy expressed, is less about yet another experience to move through, and more an opportunity to slow down, unplug, pay attention. A wild church seeks to counteract often a number of the ways that we have been programmed. We can be frenetic, capitalist, consumptive, and so we want to unlearn some of these behaviors, many of which are driving climate chaos. So we often ground ourselves by turning our attention to our senses, sounds, what do we hear, touch, what are we feeling on our skin, under our feet, sense, sights, of course. Contemplative traditions may call this centering. And for us, wild church participants are often people looking for healthy or holistic experiences, spiritual experiences. And so we find that it's important to take our time and to ease into worship together. Some wild church participants join as they seek to heal from harm they've experienced in churches, or perhaps an alternative to what has become a stuffy religion for them. So a grounding can really be trauma sensitive as we join together. Religion has its ways, some of you may know, of taking away bodily autonomy or bodily awareness, which leads to all sorts of ills. So a grounding can really increase our attention to what's going on within us and pay attention to ourselves as well as what's around us. So in indoor settings, you may turn and greet your neighbor, you may pass the peace. In out of doors, we always have more neighbors to acquaint ourselves with. Groundings can help us just pay attention to, even as Wendy mentioned earlier on in her grounding, just simple miracles that perhaps we take for granted. As we take a few deep breaths together, we notice the trees and plants that take in CO2 that we breathe out, and they breathe out the CO2 that we breathe in. We are in relationship, and there are amazing miracles around us that we get to pay attention to. We often give an opportunity in our wild church experiences for the community to just silently acknowledge with a nod or a gesture to the more than human neighbors around us, or perhaps a prayer of gratitude. So in summary, in a grounding, we ask, where are we? Who are we with? And even a few minutes can be just really helpful in helping the community transition, get comfortable in the space that we're in, tune out or tune down any perceived threats around us, and prepare ourselves to engage well. That's grounding. Next, wandering. Christine Walters-Paetner, in her book I have over here, says, creation itself is a sacred text through which the presence of God is revealed to us. Creation itself is a sacred text. Some Christian traditions have believed that God reveals God's self through two books, the book of Scripture and the book of creation. The scriptures that hold many of our communities together, they have a context that is largely out of doors. Jesus' parables, teaching by the Sea of Galilee, mountainsides, roads, fields, wilderness, I could go on. The primary locales for God's activity in the world within our scriptures is not within human-made scriptures. And I could even argue that when Jesus taught in temples and synagogues, that was primarily to redirect the religious leaders. So pedagogically, if we are groups of people exploring the ways of Jesus and God's work and witness in the world, how and where we do this matters, especially in our age of climate crisis, food insecurity, etc. So instead of a homily or a sermon, Wild Church offers a time of wandering and wondering. People can do this solo, in pairs, in one place, or on a walk. It's an opportunity for reflection, listening for God's presence, or as Sandy said, for God to preach, and to hear of God's wisdom as revealed in the natural world. So wandering is an opportunity for the body of Christ to intentionally connect with our Creator amongst created things, not amongst buildings made of our own hands, but among the beauty and mystery of creation, buds, composting leaves, dragonflies, nests, cobwebs. And sometimes we'll give a guided prompt, but often not. However, we do usually allow ourselves to be drawn to something, anything, a fallen leaf, stick, stone, moss, and without disturbing the landscape, we'll ask folks to bring something back to place on the communion table, where we create an altar for the community to see the many different ways that we have been touched by God and taught by creation. And in our setting, we often call the community back with a gentle bell or whistle. So that's wandering. Lee?
We like to include storytelling and sharing in our liturgy. When Jesus is asked by an expert in the law, "Who is my neighbor?" he responds by telling a story of the Good Samaritan, as many of us know and remember. And that parable expands our understanding of who we are obligated to love. And to paraphrase the Senegalese environmentalist Baba Diom, we won't save places we don't love, and we can't love places we don't know, and we don't know places we haven't learned. So we like to include a story that helps us get to know the human and more than human neighbors in our watershed, so we can learn to love them well. We have invited an Indigenous friend who's a member of a First Nation who's lived in this watershed since time immemorial to still tell us stories about how her ancestors have interacted with this place and this estuary over many, many years. We've had a local permaculture gardener share a story. I've done some sharing about cattail, which is ubiquitous in the estuary around us. And I drew from Robin Wall Kimmerer's classic book, Braiding Sweetgrass. And when I do the storytelling, I like to often print out and distribute several little quotes or facts to help and distribute them to help encourage and increase engagement. So it's not just a monologue from me, but prompting people to read various quotes to help fill out the picture of whatever story we're telling. And also, as Darren mentioned, at the end of the wandering time, we invite people back into the circle and hold space for anyone to share anything that they noticed during their wandering. So I'd encourage you, if you try Wild Church, to draw from your relational networks in your watersheds, invite folks who hold the stories of where you live to attend Wild Church and to share a story. And consider offering them a gift in return. We've offered a gift of salmon that somebody caught in exchange for a story as an expression of gratitude, or vegetables from one of our local gardens. Next, communion. We participate in communion every time we gather for Wild Church. And for me, Wild Church is about learning how to reconnect with creation in life-giving, respectful, and reciprocal ways, moving away from a more detached or extractive or exploitative relationship with the earth. So I like to view Wild Church communion as a meal of remembrance, a meal that remembers us, reconnects the members back to the body, back to one another, flora and fauna members, human members, connecting us all back to Christ, who holds us all together. and to be reminded of that. We use a liturgy from Solal and Cedar, a watershed discipleship community near us, and we adapt it to name the flora and fauna of the specific site we are gathered. So we change it depending on where we are. The liturgy also has us offer a piece of bread back to the earth as an act of gratitude, and we pour some of the cup out onto the soil in recognition of the earth's brokenness. And we always ask for volunteers of somebody to take some of the bread and offer it back to the earth and pour out the cup. And kids seem to love to participate in that act. So it's a great way to involve children. And I think there were some links to various communion liturgies in the Leader magazine article about Wild Church earlier. So Wendy, can you offer us some words about troubleshooting?
Yes, so we figured that this being new for most of you, 70% of you said you've never experienced a wild church worship before. And those of you who have maybe never led one, we thought, well, there's going to be some questions, and we tried to anticipate a few of the questions that might come forward before we have the open question time. So the first question that we thought people might have, and in fact, I was talking with a local pastor whose church is doing this summer, and he said, we're wondering more about what to do with children. So that was the first thing we thought we could talk about a little bit. And each of us have something to say, and I'll just say we don't at Burning Bush Forest Church do programming, children's programming. We see that what we're doing is rich and engaging and intergenerational. But that to say, there are sometimes, it is sometimes helpful to have a bit of a plan, a bit of something extra to do with the children. And so Sandy had shown a picture of a little booklet that I created that could help children if they're doing some silence on their own, to give them something to think about and look about. And I'll just give a little shout out in case Amy doesn't do it at all at any point, but these new Follow the Peace Path cards, Peace with Creation, that Menno Media sent out, at least all the Mennonite churches in Canada received them. Well, I don't know. In MCEC, we all received them last month. They are fantastic, and I have them in my bin. I have a little bag of children's activities that I have along in case we need a little something extra to keep the children busy. I'll let anyone else who wants to jump in about children.
Yeah, I can. In our experience, Wild Church suits kids really well. You know, the parents may say otherwise. There's always challenges, of course, but there's so much to engage them in the natural world around us, and they can also often teach the adults how to be curious. The Wild Church circle itself is porous in our settings, so kids can sometimes play adjacent to the circle or drift in and out of participation. We find screen-free time is just a win. It's awesome to have activities that don't involve screens. At our last Wild Church, for example, 2 kids just built a fort near where the circle is. We'll often set out coloring materials or fidgets, activity books that the children and adults can use. Adults appreciate that sometimes too. And we do have a growing kit of activities that caregivers can use for the kids. So for example, just a little kit of microscopes with a couple of guiding questions that caregivers can use. However, also, like when we do have available or interest, we'll have an adult guide the kids during the time of wandering as well. So if there's a keen adult to just grab the handful of kids and draw out their curiosity, we'll do that too.
I'll share that one of my spiritual mentors is Pippi Longstockings, because she hid things for children to find. And I think the children, well, adults too, just love to find things like in the woods. All of a sudden there's a mailbox, or like the picture on the bottom right. We have prayer centers around with gems on it that the children can take a gem to remember what was at that site for them. Or we ask them to count things. They like to count, like the number of skunk cabbages that they see coming up in February, or the number of ramps that they can find this past month, or whatever there is in nature to notice, especially for that time of year. give them ideas of what to find.
Thanks. And I'll just say that I did create I had already a handout that I had created in the past for children in Forest Church, and I added a second page with 10 little things that you can do. And Alyssa has that, and she'll send it out as with a response, an email afterwards. So you'll get that in your inboxes. So the next thing we thought you might wonder about is, how do we approach accessibility? And so, yes, questions of physical accessibility are always a concern. How do we make sure that people can participate who would like to participate and can do so in a safe way? I've had experience with a person in a wheelchair participating in a Forest Church I've led, and it took some commitment on her husband's part to make sure it worked. But when we were aware of what the limitations are, it is quite possible to plan ahead and make sure that the space you're using can work for wheelchairs, walkers, canes, those sorts of things. And so assuming that you know at least the congregation members who might come, start to think about, as you're picking a location, what will work and what won't. And then make sure you communicate it with your congregation beforehand so that they know what to expect, that we're going to be going to a park, but there's a level path, or those sorts of things, just so that they have a sense of what to expect. Also, that this wandering time, and it's been mentioned already, this is a big bulk of the time spent together. It doesn't need to be physically getting up and walking to wander. You can wander just as well seated in one spot and looking and listening to what's going on around you. And so the wandering doesn't have to be a physical activity. Another thing to note is that accessibility also takes the form of cognitive accessibility. And I was talking with a woman who teaches in the area of spirituality and disabilities at one of our local seminaries here. And she commented that adapting for differing physical abilities was something that she thought was quite easy to do. But she wanted to point out that the way that we do Forest Church or Wild Church is actually quite a bit more accessible for people with a variety of different cognitive abilities, because it is less head-oriented and more experiential. And so people who might not be verbal can participate in different ways. And also, I've had an experience where there was a woman who was had a severe brain injury and wasn't able to be inside church anymore because of the fluorescent lights, the PA system, and the scents. And they actually searched out alternative places of worship, and that's how they found our Forest Church, because the only way she could participate in worship was if it was outdoors. And they didn't even know such a thing existed, but Google directed them to us. And so that was a learning for me, in that in some ways, Wild Church or Forest Church can be more accessible for some people. If people have more questions specifically later, and that wasn't enough, you can ask more questions later. But weather.
Yeah, that's one of the first questions a lot of people ask. What do you do about the weather? In our first year of holding Wild Church monthly services, we only gathered from April to October, as it can get quite cold and damp out here in the Pacific Northwest. But we found that we missed our Wild Church gatherings over the winter. So in our second year, we began gathering monthly year-round. And I confess, sometimes it's been incredibly windy. It hailed a couple months ago at our gathering. It poured 2 weeks ago at our gathering. The one rainy day in 2 weeks was our Wild Church Day. But it's also been warm and sunny. But like the weather, our spiritual lives are unpredictable. And finding beauty in the rain and adapting to weather changes provides an opportunity to reflect on the role spirituality plays in our lives during adversity. And when we respond to discomfort and less than ideal circumstances. We found also it's helpful to simply name the discomfort rather than try to just power through it and ignore it. and to ask people how it's impacting their participation or their mood. So best not to ignore the discomfort, but to name it and to guide the community in just simply reflecting upon it. So how do we choose a location? We look for 4 things. One is accessibility, as Wendy talked about. We don't like to ask people to walk more than 100 meters from a parking lot, and we like that walk to be flat and even surfaced. Proximity to washrooms is really important for us. Having a covering, so in case it is hailing, having some shelter is helpful for us, although we don't always have a covered space. And we look for spots with several wandering routes. Having several options for people to explore and directions for them to wander allows people to go off on their own if they want a solo experience, and to exercise their agency. That is, to make choices about what that wandering time looks like. And this can be meaningful because many of us have been shaped in religious settings that have robbed us of our agency, where the spiritual life has been largely prescripted for us. So giving people opportunity to exercise their agency, to wander where they are led, helps people in their own personal discernment. Where do I sense that I'm drawn? How might this landscape be calling me? Where might God be nudging me? And we find that's a really helpful practice. We tend to rotate meeting locations, but I know of a wild church south of us in Bellingham, Washington, that has experimented with meeting in one location each season. And that way they get to experience that location changing over the months, and then they'll switch, say, in the summer to a new location, in the fall, new location. And 3 of our current 4 locations are bookable. They are in regional parks, so we can reserve the shelter. So we've got that covering in case there's bad weather. If you don't have the funds to reserve that space, which there's often a cost to it, improvising and pivoting can also be very memorable experience. We actually didn't book the pavilion 2 weeks ago, and when we showed up for Wild Church, there were 50 people there celebrating Orthodox Easter, and so we had to pivot, and we gathered under a chestnut tree, and it was very memorable as we found shelter during a pretty significant rain. But I don't think anybody will forget that experience. So Darren, could you offer us some words around tech and sound?
Often you'll probably just be able to circle up with your crew around you, but if you are in a case where you've got a lot of people where you need to think about projection, well, you are blessed to have a lot of people at your Wild Church experience to have to think about that. Our Wild Church expressions are pretty much entirely unplugged. There have been instances when we have been too large a group and speakers can't be heard by everyone, or sometimes it's been too windy to hear. So we've had to learn the hard way which locations work best. You might need to be mindful too of if there's roadways or highways near where you're meeting. A few things from us: we tend to print a bulletin with a good chunk of the liturgy for all to follow along. So if you can't hear super well, then at least you can follow along. As Lee mentioned, yeah, we meet in public parks often, and many of them don't allow for amplification. So otherwise, yeah, there's a lot of portable speaker options out there these days with Bluetooth capabilities as well. So you can always sort one of those out for yourself. One thing we have experimented with is a device called Audio Fetch. It's this little thing over here. This device connects to a small lapel mic that you can attach for any speakers, and then that device connects to this, and then this puts out a signal which can be picked up by a cell phone, and so then when people can pull it up on their own phones, the audio, and they can control the audio themselves through earbuds, or sometimes hearing aids can be connected to their phone where they can control that way. We found after all that, kind of a little too cumbersome for it to be practical for people. So we kind of just, many don't use that anymore. One final comment I'll just make about tech as it philosophically, you know, and as one who has set up many different worship experiences for people in many different church settings, I've really come to love the simplicity of what a wild church setting allows. In many churches, the direction and focus is towards a stage or a platform, and what is amplified from there. But wild church is an opportunity for us to unlearn some of those ways that we've been formed, to move away from the monologue, sitting in pews, to an omnidirectional dialogue, to build a community in a circle. And so, of course, you want that to be, when it comes to tech, you want that to be accessible for everyone. But we try and move away from a performance into a circle when it comes to wild church. So that's my encouragement to pass on.
Maybe just make one quick note. I know that a lot of churches these days do live streaming during their worship, and especially since the pandemic. My church, my Forest Church, has been going since before the pandemic, and when the pandemic hit and everyone was pivoting to online worship, we decided not to do anything virtually, even though there were a few wild churches out there who did figure out ways to do virtual wild church. But instead we created self-guided outlines that people could do where they were located. And I mentioned that a local church was talking to me about using these worship materials this summer, and they were thinking that even though they have been in the practice of live streaming their services, that they're going to do just that. They're not going to do any live streaming. They're not going to do Facebook Live or anything like that. But instead, before the service, they're going to send out prompts that would match up with what the congregation is doing that morning. And so people who can't come, who are away, who live at a distance but have been following their church virtually, are able to participate in the same kind of worship but remotely. And so I thought that's one thing to note if you've been wondering, well, what do we do with our virtual audience? So I think we have time now for questions. Amy, are there questions that have come up in the Q&A that we should touch on still?
There were a couple specific questions that Darren has already typed an answer to. One person asked for more information about audio fetch and how you could find out about that, and it's just audiofetch.com. And so the device that he referenced is called AudioFetch Express. So check that out if that's something you're interested in. Another person asked about the opening song and if that's included, and Darren notes that that song and many other paperless songs are compiled by Music That Makes Community, and that website is musicthatmakescommunity.org. We'll pop in the link in the chat. It's in the worship resources as well. It's actually a comment here from someone. It's the only one left here. I tend to need projection outside for even very small groups due to people with hearing impairment. Any responses to that or ways that you have worked at that in your wild church groups?
Like audio projection or visual projection?
I'm guessing audio. It doesn't say. It just says I need projection due to people with hearing impairment.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we have had some settings where we use amplification outside. We had a pilgrimage for Gaza recently, and that park did allow amplification. Little side note: the person who booked for us, they had a hearing impairment, and so they really appreciated our request to have amplification. So sometimes it's just who you talk to, I suppose. But we have a Bose speaker that is has a rechargeable battery, so we can kind of take that anywhere and plug that in. So there's a number of those Another one's called Party Box that we've used in the past as well. So there's a number of those for anything from beach parties to Wild Church.
I haven't used any personally, but I did do a little bit of research recently, and I won't be able to tell you specific names, but if you Google voice amplification systems, there are a range of small things that, you know, just wear a headset and then a small microphone does that. Like, it's not a big speaker, it's just a small speaker that amplifies it somewhat. And I also noticed, I haven't quite been able to follow up on it, but there are apparently apps, and I think they're better on Apple than they are on Android. I have an Android, but apps that convert your cell phone into a microphone that Bluetooths to a portable speaker, a Bluetooth speaker. So I think there's more and more options out there that can help. And I've often told the people who have problems hearing to stand closer to me.
There you go. There you go. We've got another question here from Clayton asking about hybrid. He writes, we're planning to do a sort of hybrid, which will start in our church sanctuary, and then the sermon time will be out in the woods behind our church. Do you have any advice or concerns about what he's suggesting here, or for others who are attempting to do some hybrid?
Yeah, I think that's great. As a former pastor who's used leader materials for worship a lot, I know that these things always need to be adapted to your own setting and your own context. And so I think if that's what will work for you, go for it. And yeah, I have been in a few settings where I've done similar things when I've spoke at different churches, and it seems to work well. And particularly, I think if there are, you know, a few, you know, people with mobility issues who aren't even going to be able to leave the building, if you have a few things available for them to choose from, an assortment of I hate the word objects, because anyone who's read Robin Wall Kimmerer knows our English language objectifies anything that's not human. But if you have pieces of creation that you can bring in, or pictures or windows that can allow people to wander even if they can't leave the building. But yeah, it's definitely possible to do your wandering and then return for the sharing again.
Yeah, to that question, I think having woods by your church building is a great opportunity to both care for it and to learn from it. So to bring any opportunities you can to bring the community into that is great. We all know, you know, many of us experience God in creation, and so a big part of Wild Church is just to make that a communal experience, not just one or two or small groups of people going on a hike or walk, but to make that a part of the experience of the community together. So I think you have great opportunities there.
Great. Thank you so much.
Can I just make one quick note that for churches out there who are in cities and urban centers who are wondering how to do this, I wanted to just say that nature creation is everywhere. And Salal and Cedar, who was named or mentioned earlier, they've done Wild Church in a Walmart parking lot. And so, you know, there's still sky, there's still the elements, there's birds, there's ways to connect, even if you're meeting in your church parking lot and you don't think there's much nature there, there's ways to pay attention and to yeah, commune with creation.
Awesome. Jan writes, we're planning to have the kids gather interesting things from outside during Sunday school and bring them in for those who can't go outside for our hybrid Wild Church approach. So another great idea. Thanks, Jan. Just a reminder to everyone that this webinar is being recorded, so you can share it with others on your worship team. It will be posted next week to Minnow Media's YouTube channel. If you registered today for the webinar, you'll get an email link to it as well. And I just want to thank Wendy for pulling together this panel, for suggesting this idea. If this kind of webinar on the worship resources in Leader Magazine or something you would appreciate again, please let us know as well. Thanks to Lee and Sandy and Darren and Wendy for the great ideas, and we'll turn it back to the team.
Sandy, would you like to lead us in a closing blessing?
Yeah. If you're in a group of people that want to read it with me together, this is a wild blessing that was suggested by the Fresno Wild Church. Whatever wilderness the Spirit has brought you to, walk in boldness as a beloved child of God. Walk in peace under the shelter of the Most High. Walk in faith, knowing Christ walks with you. May you all be wild and free as you plan and engage with our Creator in worship this summer and beyond. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.